When I was a boy, I used to wake up to mornings that felt different. Not in the small ways, like the weather shifting, or my shoes pinching my toes because I was growing faster than the leather could keep up. No. These mornings felt as if the world itself had turned in its sleep and woken up wearing a new face. I didn't have the words adults used for these changes. They said things like markets and systems and economies. But as a child, I only noticed what was right in front of me. The way light fell across the kitchen table. The way my parents spoke in softer or sharper tones. The way the air itself carried a hum, as if it knew something I didn't. One morning, I padded into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from my eyes, and everything was brighter. Not the light exactly, but the mood. My mother was sitting at the table with her tea, and she was smiling. Not a little smile, not the kind that sneaks across your lips when someone tells a joke. This was a wide, quiet smile, the kind that looks like it's been waiting years to show itself. My father wasn't in his work clothes. That was the first sign that something unusual had happened. By that time in the morning, he was usually buttoning his shirt, tying his shoes, already halfway out the door with coffee in hand. But on that day, he sat still, calm, as if the rush of years had suddenly stopped to let him breathe. I climbed into my chair, still too small for my feet to touch the floor, and asked what was different. My mother looked at me with eyes shining brighter than the morning sun and said, "Everyone has $1 million now." The words didn't land the way she expected. They floated in the air above my bowl of cereal like balloons I couldn't quite grab. Everyone? 1 million? The numbers had no weight in my mind. To me, 1 million was just a word used for impossible things. 1 million stars, 1 million jelly beans, 1 million wishes. I laughed. "Does that mean we can buy a trampoline?" I asked, my voice still scratchy with sleep. My father chuckled and leaned back in his chair, looking younger than I had ever seen him. "With this money," he said, "we could buy the whole trampoline park." I didn't know if he was serious, but I liked the sound of it. The idea that we could own an entire world of bouncing floors and padded walls felt like magic. The kitchen felt warmer then. The orange juice in my glass sparkled brighter. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to carry a lighter note, as though it, too, knew that life had changed overnight. The world outside was the same as yesterday, but I could feel it. Something enormous had shifted, something I didn't understand, but couldn't wait to explore. And as I looked at my parents, one calm, one smiling, both different than I had ever seen them, I realized that this morning would be a story I would never forget. It was the morning the world woke up with $1 million in every pocket, and I was just a boy trying to understand what that meant. The kitchen table looked the same as every other morning. Same chipped corner, same wobble in the left leg. But I could feel something was different. Breakfast wasn't just breakfast. It was brighter, almost like a celebration without balloons. Dad poured me a glass of orange juice. Then, without saying anything, he poured a second and set it beside the first. "In case you get extra thirsty," he said with a grin. I laughed, though I wasn't sure why 2 glasses suddenly seemed so funny. It wasn't the juice that was different. It was the freedom in his voice, the way he spoke like a man unchained from an invisible clock. I reached for the cereal box with its cartoon tiger waving from the front. Mom stopped me mid-pour. "You know," she said, tapping the box, "this cost 10 times more than yesterday." I froze, spoon in hand. "Does it taste 10 times better?" I asked. Dad burst out laughing. Mom smiled, but her eyes carried a shadow of thought. I scooped a bite anyway, chewing slowly, testing each crunch for magic. Nope. Same old cereal. I swallowed and shook my head. It's a scam, I declared. They laughed again, though the word I chose made them exchange glances, as if the joke I didn't understand carried some heavier truth they didn't want to explain just yet. On the counter sat the envelope where we kept coupons and receipts. It was usually stuffed full, thick with folded paper that smelled faintly of ink and worry. But that morning, it lay flat and open, almost empty. Mom picked it up, slid it into a drawer, and closed it without looking. The sound of the drawer's click echoed in the room, louder than it should have. To me, it felt like a lock turning on the past. Dad didn't check his watch. Normally, time ruled his mornings: toast, tie, keys, door. But that day, he leaned back in his chair and ate slowly, almost lazily, like a man savoring his food for the first time in years. He asked if I wanted another egg. I said yes, because it felt like saying yes to more than just breakfast. I studied everything like it might vanish if I blinked too fast. The sunlight spilling over the fridge magnets. The faded zoo photo where I stood grinning with a popsicle-stained mouth. The grocery list written in Mom's neat loops. Milk, bread, apples. Next to apples, Dad had scrawled something in his messy handwriting. Mangoes. That single word glowed on the page like a promise. Mangoes weren't everyday fruit. They were vacation fruit. I decided I liked this new world already, if it meant mangoes could appear on our list without anyone worrying about the price. Mom leaned against the sink, her fingertips resting on the counter, watching us. "Do you think you'll go in today?" she asked Dad. He shrugged, not careless, but lighter. "Maybe later," he said. Then, after a pause, "Maybe not at all." Her eyes widened, and then she laughed, a sound so free it startled me. I had never heard my mother laugh at the idea of skipping work. The sound filled the kitchen like sunlight spilling into every corner. I asked if school would be different too. Mom tilted her head and kissed my hair. "School is always different when you are," she whispered. I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I carried those words with me like a secret note tucked in my pocket. In the hallway, my shoes waited with laces open, tongues sticking out like little mouths. I tied them carefully, loop by loop, because somehow it felt important to be neat on such a morning. On the shelf, the jar where we kept coins for someday sat half full. I used to shake it just to hear the clatter. That day, I didn't. The coins looked tired, like they had been released from duty. Before we stepped outside, Dad opened the back door. The smell of wet grass drifted in, mixed with something sweet I couldn't name. The neighbor's wind chime played a soft tune and then fell silent, as though even it was pausing to listen. "Feels different," Dad said quietly. Mom nodded. None of us explained why. We just stood there for a long moment, letting the air itself remind us that the world had changed. When Mom finally handed me my backpack, it felt lighter than usual, though I knew nothing inside had changed. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, but what I meant was, ready for the world to taste new, even if the cereal didn't. The street outside was alive in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't the usual shuffle of commuters heading to cars or buses, or the slow rhythm of neighbors watering lawns. It was louder, brighter, almost like the whole block had been waiting for this day to finally throw a parade. New cars, their paint still gleaming like candy wrappers, sat in driveways. Ribbons flapped in the breeze. Children ran circles around them, waving toys that still smelled like plastic and paint. Adults hugged, shook hands, and held envelopes like golden tickets. It felt less like an ordinary morning and more like the start of a holiday the calendar had forgotten to name. Mrs. Alvarez, who usually sat quietly on her porch with her knitting basket, was out front dragging boxes to the curb. "No more sweaters," she called to anyone who would listen. "I'm opening a flower shop." Her voice rang out like a bell, bright and certain. I pictured her new shop bursting with sunflowers taller than me, their yellow heads beaming out onto the street. For a moment, it was easy to believe flowers could keep people warm the way her scarves once did. At the corner store, the doors squeaked open and closed nonstop. Normally, its aisles were tidy and quiet. That day, they were chaos. Children filled their arms with candy bars. Parents loaded baskets with soda, chips, and fruit, not in careful portions, but in heaps, as if the shelves might never need to be restocked again. The cartoon characters on the packaging smiled wider than usual, grinning as if they knew they had become part of history. By noon, half the shelves stood empty, but instead of worry, there was laughter. "Don't worry," a man said, stacking too many bags of rice in his cart. "They'll bring more tomorrow." At the bus stop, Mr. Patel sat alone on the bench, cap in his lap. Usually, he rode downtown on the 8 o'clock bus. That morning, no bus arrived. Word spread quickly. The driver had quit to open a bakery. People laughed, and Mr. Patel just shook his head with a smile. "Maybe I'll walk," he said softly. His tone wasn't bitter, just thoughtful, as though he'd been handed a puzzle piece that almost fit, but not quite. School felt different too. The yard was quieter, half the desks inside empty. Some children had stayed home to celebrate, or perhaps their parents had already whisked them off on new adventures. Those of us who came carried shiny backpacks, new sneakers, and wide grins. One boy bragged that his father had ordered a race car. Another whispered that his parents were flying to Paris, though he said it like parrots, which made us laugh so hard the teacher had to cover her smile with her hand. Suddenly, anything sounded possible. Why not a world where parrots flew planes to France? Instead of spelling tests, our teacher asked us to draw what we would do with $1 million. I drew a trampoline the size of a football field, with ladders leading up like a castle wall. Sarah drew a house floating on clouds. Daniel sketched a spaceship that looked suspiciously like a soup can with fins. Mrs. Green didn't correct us or talk about neat handwriting. She simply nodded, as if each dream was already waiting just outside the window. On the way home, the park was alive with people. Picnic blankets dotted the grass. Radios played music. A man stood by a grill handing out hot dogs for free. "I can buy 1,000 more," he shouted, and the crowd cheered. Children ran barefoot, their pockets filled with candy wrappers, their cheeks pink with joy. Even the pigeons looked fatter, hopping from one generous hand to another. But there were shadows at the edges too. The grocery truck that usually parked near the fountain never arrived. Someone muttered that the driver had quit as well. A hush fell for a moment, but then Mrs. Alvarez, the soon-to-be florist, raised her voice. "I've been baking bread. I'll bring loaves tomorrow." Cheers erupted, as if she had promised treasure. I didn't see fear in that moment, only faith. Faith that if one thing fell away, something else would appear to fill the gap. Walking home, I scuffed my shoes against the pavement, watching the late sun smear the street in gold. The town felt like a carnival that had sprung up overnight. Rides spun, games buzzed, prizes glittered. And even if some rides broke down, I believed, without question, that someone would fix them or build new ones from scratch. That evening, the house was quieter than the morning had promised. We still ate dinner together, chicken, potatoes, a salad, but the air felt different, like the laughter had slipped out through a crack in the window. My parents spoke in shorter sentences, leaving pauses that seemed too heavy for the room. Dad set down his fork and said, "Prices are already rising." Faster than I expected, Mom pushed her salad around the plate. Of course they're rising. Everyone's spending like the rules don't exist anymore. It's like floodgates have opened. I looked at my plate, confused. Floodgates? I pictured rivers of bread crashing through town, whole loaves tumbling past lampposts, people scooping them up in buckets. The image made me grin, but I kept quiet. Grown-ups didn't look like they wanted to laugh. Then Dad used the word again, the one that felt heavier than all the others. Inflation. "Money is shrinking," he said, almost to himself. I turned toward the jar of coins on the counter. They looked the same size they always had, gleaming like small suns under the kitchen light. I wondered if, when no one was looking, they really did shrink, curling smaller and smaller like dried leaves in the autumn. Mom sighed. What happens when people stop working? Who grows the food? Who keeps the lights on? Her voice trembled like the string of a violin. I shifted in my chair. Those questions sounded like the beams of a house. If they broke, wouldn't the whole roof fall? But then Dad leaned back, his voice steadier. "People adapt," he said. "They always do." Something in the way he said it made me relax. It was like hearing a door close against the wind. If adults thought the world would figure itself out, then maybe the shrinking coins weren't so scary after all. At school the next day, Mrs. Green picked up her chalk and wrote a word that stretched across the board. Economy. She told us that when everyone has too much money, things can break. It's like crayons, she explained. If every student has too many crayons, you'll color on the desks, on the floor, on each other. And soon, paper will run out. We laughed, imagining the classroom buried in rainbows. But Mrs. Green didn't laugh. She tapped her chalk twice, leaving pale dots on the board, and looked at us with eyes that seemed tired. Her warning passed over us like wind through trees. All we heard was the fun part: endless crayons, endless colors. Later, I overheard two teachers whispering in the hallway. "We'll run out of supplies before the month is over," one said. The other replied, "Or maybe new supplies will appear." People are clever when they need to be. Their footsteps faded, but I held on to that last sentence like it was a marble in my pocket. People are clever when they need to be. I turned it over and over in my mind, polishing it until it gleamed. Even at the grocery store, the whispers followed us. The grocer frowned at empty milk shelves and muttered, "Drivers don't want to haul dairy when they can invest their millions somewhere else." But then, almost in the same breath, he added, "Someone will step in." They always do. He said it like he was trying to convince himself. Still, I liked those words. They always do. That night in bed, I listened to the sounds of the town drifting through the window. Car engines, faint music, a burst of laughter. Beneath it, though, I thought I heard something softer, a note of worry that hummed under everything else, quiet but insistent. It wasn't frightening. It was simply there, like a riddle I wasn't old enough to solve. And in my child's mind, riddles were exciting, not dangerous. Adults saw risks and called them problems. I saw puzzles waiting for clever hands to put the pieces together. To me, the world wasn't collapsing. It was stretching, bending, learning how to dance to a new rhythm. Weeks passed, and mornings stopped feeling ordinary. Each day I stepped outside, The world seemed to have rearranged itself overnight, as if unseen hands had shuffled the pieces while we slept. The air buzzed differently, not the hum of traffic and bus engines, but the sound of hammers, guitars, laughter spilling from porches, new voices testing old dreams. The grocery driver who once parked his truck by the fountain now stood behind the counter of a bakery he had built with his million. His hands, once steady on a steering wheel, were dusted white with flour. The bread he pulled from the oven came out golden and steaming, and the line to buy it wrapped around the block. People clapped when he set down trays of rolls, cheering as though he were a performer. I thought it strange that bread could earn applause, but I clapped anyway, enjoying the way his face lit up. Farther down the street, the hardware store had changed its sign overnight. The nails and screws in the window were gone, replaced with canvases splashed in colors so bold they looked like storms captured in paint. The owner, Mr. Klein, once quiet and slow to speak, stood in front of a half-finished painting with an apron tied around his waist. When I asked why he was painting, he said simply, "I always wanted to see if I could." The smell of sawdust had faded from his shop, replaced with the sharp tang of oils and turpentine. I wasn't sure if anyone would buy the paintings, but people still walked in to look, curious, smiling, lingering longer than they used to among the hammers. Neighbors began to trade more than money. Mrs. Alvarez, who had abandoned her knitting needles, delivered flowers to our door every few days. Bright yellows, deep purples, roses with petals like velvet. In return, Mom gave her jars of jam. It felt less like buying and selling, and more like sharing. Each exchange carried laughter, as if the items themselves were excuses to remind one another that we were all still here, still trying. School changed, too. Half the desks sat empty. Some children traveled with their families, chasing adventures now made possible. Those who stayed brought unusual lunches, French cheeses, candies wrapped in foil, fruit from countries I'd only read about on maps. We traded bites like explorers, each taste a new discovery. Our teachers no longer pressed us for perfect handwriting. They seemed distracted, lost in thoughts of what they might do next. I heard one whisper to another about starting a cafe. Another mentioned moving to the coast to teach art. It was as if the adults had become students again, eager to see what life could offer. But not everything worked smoothly. Sometimes the milk shelves stayed empty. Sometimes buses didn't arrive and children walked instead. Mom frowned once when she couldn't find flour. Dad muttered that systems are breaking down. The words sounded heavy, but to me it felt like waiting for a toy to be fixed. Annoying, yes, but temporary. Someone will bring it, I told myself. And someone always did, eventually. Evenings carried new music. Instead of the rush of engines or the groan of tired commuters, I heard guitars, drums, and voices rising in chorus from backyards. Bonfires glowed like tiny suns scattered across the neighborhood. Families gathered, neighbors passed bottles of soda and plates of food, and stories replaced television. It felt as though the world had decided to loosen its tie and laugh a little louder. One night, Dad sat on the porch with his hands folded in his lap. "It's chaos," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. It sounded almost like wonder. Mom, sitting beside him, shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It's change." I liked her word better. Change sounded like planting a seed and waiting for the first green sprout. And when I looked down our street, filled with gardens, paintings, bread, and songs, it truly felt like a garden. Some flowers bloomed quickly, others wilted. Some spread seeds on the wind. But no matter what, there was always something new pushing through the soil. At night, when the street grew quiet and the porch lights glowed like little moons, I would lie in bed and wonder what the world might look like years from now. Not just tomorrow, but long after the million-dollar morning had faded into memory. In my imagination, the city no longer belonged to gray office towers. Instead, walls bloomed with color, painted by people who had once sat at desks crunching numbers. I saw whole streets transformed into galleries, murals of dragons curling across brick, suns and oceans spilling across concrete. Even the sidewalks changed. Musicians and inventors lined them, showing their creations to anyone curious enough to stop. It felt like the world had turned itself inside out, revealing the dreams that had always been hidden underneath. Families looked different too. Fathers didn't rush out before sunrise, ties half-tied, coffee in hand. They lingered in kitchens, walked their children to school, built tree houses that scraped the sky. Mothers had time to laugh over bread dough, to read books in the sunlight, to plant flowers without counting every penny in the soil. Evenings weren't silent or rushed. They were filled with games, long dinners, voices drifting out of open windows. Laughter no longer felt like a weekend treat. It became the soundtrack of daily life. Sometimes I remembered the way adults worried. I had heard them say, "The world can't run without structure," or "Who will keep the lights on?" Their voices had tension, like ropes pulled too tight. But in my mind, those ropes never snapped. They loosened, twisted, and made new patterns. People found ways. They always had. I imagined lights powered by the sun, farms run by clever machines, neighbors sharing what they grew so no one went hungry. To me, the problems weren't threats. They were invitations to invent. And sometimes, I dreamed of robots. Not the scary kind from movies, but friendly helpers made of silver and sparks. They swept the streets, fixed leaky pipes, cooked simple meals. They weren't there to replace people, but to free them. I pictured my dad handing chores to a robot so he could say, "Now let's play catch." To me, the robots weren't danger. They were partners, giving us back the hours we'd lost to tiredness. In my daydreams, money itself began to fade into the background. If everyone had it, maybe someday no one would count it at all. Instead, people traded skills, ideas, and kindness. You bake bread, I paint your wall. You fix my roof, I teach your child the violin. The world became a giant playground where the games were about sharing, not winning. One evening, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I asked Dad what he thought the future would look like. He didn't answer right away. He just breathed slowly, as though he were tasting the question. Finally, he said, "It depends on what people do with their chance." His words sank into me like seeds falling into soil. I didn't know what they would grow into, but I knew they would be tall. And in my heart, I saw a future tilting toward light. Like sunflowers turning to follow the sun, people too would turn toward hope. Even if there were stumbles, even if there were nights of confusion, the next morning would always bring another chance. I believed that then, with the simple certainty only a child can hold. And maybe, even now, I still do. Looking back, I don't remember the numbers, not the charts, not the graphs, not the arguments whispered over coffee cups. What stayed with me were the colors, the smells, the sounds, the way the air itself seemed lighter, as if someone had opened a window in the world. I remember neighbors hugging longer, like they hadn't seen each other in years, even though they lived next door. I remember music drifting from porches, guitars and fiddles joining the wind. I remember children running barefoot across the park, their laughter scattering pigeons into the sky. These were the moments that taught me more than any word on the teacher's chalkboard. Yes, there were problems. Shelves went bare sometimes. Buses didn't always come. Adults frowned at ledgers, whispered about shortages, about danger. But even then, the shadows never erased the light. To me, the problems were puzzles. Difficult, yes, but solvable. And time after time, someone stepped forward to fill the gap. A bus driver turned into a baker, a shopkeeper into a painter, a quiet neighbor into a florist whose blooms made the whole street smell like summer. That's what I carry with me. The proof that beneath the routines of ordinary life, there are dreams waiting like seeds. Sometimes all it takes is one strange morning to water them. And when they sprout, the world doesn't look the same. Maybe money isn't everything. Maybe it's only a key. What matters is which doors we choose to unlock with it. Some doors lead to fear, yes, but others open onto gardens of possibility. And it is those gardens I remember most. I can still see my father leaning back in his chair, smiling without a clock pulling at him. I can still smell the flowers on our kitchen table, petals glowing in the morning sun. I can still taste the cereal that cost 10 times more, but somehow tasted sweeter because of the laughter that came with it. And I can still hear the sound of my mother's voice, lighter than it had been in years, telling me the world had changed. At the end of that day, when the sun slipped below the rooftops, I climbed into bed feeling both small and vast. Small, because I didn't understand the shadows adults worried about. Vast, because I sensed the horizon stretching farther than I had ever imagined. The world was not finished. It was rewriting itself, and I was lucky enough to witness the first lines. I closed my eyes, not afraid, but curious. Curious about tomorrow, about what shape it would take, about what stories it might bring. The $1 million morning was only the beginning, and though I was only a boy, I felt certain of one thing: people would always find a way. Even now, when I think of that day, I carry it like a lantern. It reminds me that change can be unsettling, yes, but it can also be beautiful. That chaos can give birth to creativity. That even in the strangest of times, humanity has the power to lean toward the light. And as I drifted into sleep that night, one thought echoed in my heart. Tomorrow would come, different and unfamiliar, but filled with possibility. And I, a boy lying in a small bed, was ready to dream of it.